Hope everyone's having a nice afternoon. All right, can everyone see my slide? Yeah, awesome. All right. Hello and welcome everyone to Childcare Aware of Minnesota's February 2023 Tell Talk. Today we are joined by our special guest, Michelle Lenhart from the Minnesota Department of Human Services for a conversation about closing learning gaps for young children using an equity lens. And Michelle is a legislative coordinator at DHS, and we're so very glad that she could be here with us today for this important topic. And special thanks to all of our participants as well. Tell Talks, or Topics for Early Learning Leaders, are monthly webinars for early childhood program leaders to facilitate solutions-focused discussions for your questions about the early childhood field in Minnesota. These one-hour webinars do not meet the standard for a formal professional development training event, and participants will not receive a certificate of completion. Tell Talks are designed as a community building opportunity for leaders to engage and share ideas surrounding a specific topic. Mark your calendars for March 16th, when Janet Peterson and Aaron Young will join us to talk about financial supports for early childhood educators, including the Teach Scholarship and CDA awards. Childcare Aware of Minnesota supports the professional growth of early childhood educators with professional development opportunities, including classroom trainings, eager to learn online training, and professional development advising services. We also support programs in Minnesota's quality rating and improvement system, Parent Aware. Our office administers grants and scholarships such as the Regional Grant, Retain Bonus, Teach Scholarship, CDA awards, and the Foreign Credential Evaluation Scholarship. We also have two capacity building supports, Childcare Wayfinder and Empower to Educate. To contact someone in any of these departments, visit www.childcareawaremn.org/contact-us. Empower to Educate is one of two new childcare capacity building initiatives in Minnesota. It helps current and aspiring early childhood educators begin, advance, and sustain their career goals in childcare. E2E has a statewide team of workforce advisors who provide one-on-one support to participants. Individuals in the program have access to financial supports and resource referrals, including an education preparation stipend, plus a 6-month hiring or advancement bonus. E2E includes job skills training and job placement support. The advisors can help participants set up develop accounts and individual memberships, register for a free training package, and get connected to the free job board at Achieve. They can provide ongoing career and education advising, as well as mentorship and connections to additional training and college programs. Reach out today for more information about how Empower to Educate can support your staff recruitment and retention efforts. Childcare Wayfinder is the second capacity building initiative at CCA. It is a one-stop navigation network for starting and growing childcare programs. There is a statewide team of childcare startup and retention navigators who provide guidance and support with starting a new licensed childcare program, or sustaining or expanding an already licensed childcare program. Eligible participants receive startup vouchers to support new programs in purchasing equipment and materials. Participants also have connections to resource partners, including licensors, business consultants, grant, scholarship, and loan administrators, program coaches, and workforce advisors. Visit www.childcarewayfinder.org to connect with your local navigator. The Tell Talks team partners with several organizations to offer coordinated resources surrounding early care and education needs. If you would like to get connected to any of our partners, please be in touch with us. As always, participants of Tell Talks are encouraged to ask questions, make contributions throughout the presentation, and engage in dialogue with our presenter. Feel free to turn your cameras on if you are comfortable and to unmute to share your ideas and questions. The chat and hand raise functions are also available for those who would like to use them for questions and comments about our topic. We are recording the Tell Talk, and I will send a link to the recording in my follow-up email. And now I'm excited to turn it over to our presenter, Michelle. Thank you for being with us today.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so I'll start just by introducing myself a little bit. So I work for the Department of Human Services, and one of the program areas that I work in that you'll hear about a little bit today is Parent Aware. So that's one of the areas I work in, but I work in lots of other things too, and I work on legislation related to early care and education. So, and one of the things I do is related to doing equity analysis, which means looking at different policy ideas and looking for ways to make them more equitable. So you're going to hear about that too. All right, I'm going to start sharing my screen and put my slides up. But first, actually, there was a couple of handouts. I was wondering if those got sent out in advance or if those, because they can also go out after. But
I'm just working on putting those in the chat right now, actually.
in the chat. Perfect. All right, thank you. All right, I will share my screen. Well, there we go. Can everyone see that slide? Yep. Okay.
Perfect. Yep.
All right. So this is just my opening slide, but you've already heard a little bit about me and what this is about. All right. So just to tell you a little bit about what I'm going to tell you about today. So this, I had actually originally used these slides for a national conference. And so I started out by saying that this was Minnesota's story, but all of you are from Minnesota, and so you'll know this story really well. But then there's also part of the story that I'll tell. It's about the Department of Human Services and things that have happened specifically in my department that I thought might be of interest to you too, but also might spark ideas for your own organizations. And then we'll talk a little bit about tools for equity analysis and ideas for your program. And I'm hoping that there will be some moments where we stop and talk as a group. So be ready to jump on your camera and join a group discussion as well. So this opening slide. So the story that I told at this national conference, all of you are going to know this story well, that in Minnesota, and many of them knew that this had happened here, of course, but in Minnesota, we had this experience, right, that we woke up one morning to watch footage on the news of a white officer pressing the life out of an African-American man, George Floyd. And it was shocking. You know, George Floyd was begging for mercy and was not receiving it. And it was a shocking moment for us. And I would say what I shared nationally was that as a result of that moment in time of what happened there, Minnesota became kind of an epicenter for a shift in thinking about racial equity and about racism. And one of the things that came out in Minnesota, I don't know how many of you had seen this, but there was a blog post by Diane Halsey, who at the time worked for Think Small, and now she works for a group called the Family Partnership in Minneapolis. And at that time, I read her blog post, and it was so interesting and helpful, insightful to me. And so in a moment, we're going to stop, and I want to hear your own stories about what happened for you, how your own communities reacted to that. But I'll just, to quote what Diane Halsey said in her blog post, what she took away as she was watching this happen on the news and thought, and what she was thinking about in her own head, was that the permission that she was seeing the justice system was giving that officer, or you might say the systemic racism or implicit bias that she felt like was embedded in the system, for her was, she was seeing a parallel to also that kind of implicit bias or the permission that's given to educators or to teachers, and how that and in the way that they treat children with Black and brown bodies. And so she was saying she could see the systemic racism and what was happening there on the screen, but then she was drawing a parallel to what she feels like is happening sometimes in early education in our state and really in all states. And And so I think that all of this kind of opened our eyes to racism in a new way. Um, and uh, and it would be so interesting to hear all of you share just a little bit about, let's see if that's my next slide. Yes, discuss. So is anyone interested, willing to share their own observations of how did you experience, or how did you see your communities experiencing that, what happened with George Floyd? And did you then at the time draw any parallels to things that you see in your own life or in your own work? I can call on people. Just kidding. I won't. This is a very personal topic. If you really don't feel comfortable sharing, that's right. I saw Karen.
I'll jump in because I never want to leave a trainer hanging. That's my deal. But at that time, truly, you said a phrase that I use, and that is like, open your eyes. It sounds so naive to say, oh my gosh, look, that happened. Like as a white person, I deal with and I work with a majority of white family childcare providers who live kind of in their own little home bubble. And so a couple of other fellow coaches and I were moved to create a group. We called it Kids and Culture. And we were trying to kind of get people to think past their own single experiences. Again, just as say a white person who attracts white families, and there's other families, etc. But this is their experience, and they've simply never had the opportunity to think like in someone else's shoes, is one way to put it, or how must it feel to ... And so we and this was in, of course, the pandemic, so it was Zoom meetings. And we had some real big interest at first, right after June, July, and August, and then it kind of trickled off because it was an uncomfortable topic. And we always want to meet discomfort with curiosity. I love that phrase. But it was hard. A lot of the white providers were just like, well, this doesn't really affect me. It's not part of my life. And they were kind of comfortable staying in that lane. And so, and secondarily to that, as a coach, when we work in our parent aware system and they make cultural goals, I encourage them to like, look at your culture, like we always say every family has their own culture, because every family is different. And so I kind of, if I have the time, I can explain it as like, bring it to the kids level and realize that every family is different and separate and unique and wonderful and fine. And just realize that we all, whether we're like some, joke, whether we're all white and Lutheran here, it doesn't mean we're all the same, live the same, etc. And simply really taking it down has helped them kind of just look at things just a little tiny bit, because they've never examined their own culture or their own thoughts, which leads them to be able to crack the door to their biases and implicit biases. So that was kind of a lot, but those are the two big things that I think about.
Great, thanks. Does anybody else want to share at all of anything they saw or experienced in their communities at that time?
I can share. My name's Amy Warzabak. So I guess our school is just south of St. Paul, and so we serve families in the St. Paul and Minneapolis area, and staff live in those areas. So I think after we were kind of working from home, getting ready to come back, because it was right around when our summer program was going to start. So I think staff, like as a staff, we just spent some time just talking and reflecting together, I guess. And then some people were really thinking about like what kind of materials were out there for families that needed different materials. And then sort of like, I know on a personal level for me, I think I had moved here from California, and there was like a lot of smell of like smoke in the air too. So like there were just some things around it too that were like bringing like certain feelings for me, and I think like in different ways too, like the kind of experience of like what was going on in the community and how like children were processing in it, how like adults were, processing it as well, outside of just like the initial thing that happened to George Floyd, and then kind of what happened after too. So there was just, I think, a lot of people just really needing to talk and process. And then there was in the summer, we did a like book study around just like reading up, I'm trying to remember the title of the book, and memory hasn't stuck as deeply as it used to, but it was just kind of exploring racism as like a white person, and kind of like trying to, I'll have to look up the book title because it's not coming to my brain, but I think that was a helpful thing, as like to just kind of think about. The thing I remember most about it was like the like when white people feel uncomfortable in a discussion, and how we make it about like how we're feeling uncomfortable or sad, and not kind of furthering with the discussion, I guess. So just some things that I remember. Yeah.
Was the book that you're thinking of Me and White Supremacy, perhaps?
Yeah, I think it was. That sounds right, but I should look at the title, because
I read that book too with a book club around that time. Yeah, that was a really, I thought, really helpful resource, because it gave me new vocabulary, words, and concepts that I then could name and understand better after reading that book. So I recommend that one to everyone, even if you're not white. Me and White Supremacy it's written like for a white audience, but I think it's good for any audience, actually, to help deepen understanding of different concepts related to it.
And then I just think, as like a school too, we started to look more at our practices and how we approach like diversity in all the different dimensions, but specifically there was more focus on race during kind of right after, and it's broader. It's always been there, but I think there was definitely like a strong focus for a while on that, and then how we continue that into the future too, because you don't want to just kind of follow trends in your community too. So just kind of that reflective practice that we try to honor.
Right. Did anyone else want to share just even a word or two, but we can also move on. I'm just kind of looking to see if this is resonating with other people, what you were hearing Amy talking about. There's a few faces on there. So everybody ready to go to the next one? Okay. So I'm just going to share a few terms that are just a couple terms that relate to this. And they're needed because the next part that we're going to talk about is doing equity analysis. And this is helpful background. So kind of related to some of the things that Amy was talking about, like terms that you would find in a book, like she was describing that she read. What is implicit bias? So the definition provided by the National Institutes of Health talks about it occurs automatically and unintentionally, though nevertheless affects judgments, decisions, and behaviors. And that relates a lot to systemic racism, which is a system of power that structures opportunity, like education, housing, jobs, justice, and assigns a value based on race. So these are key concepts that as you start to think about equity and looking at something and deciding whether or not a policy might need to be changed, to kind of keep in mind that people experience this kind of implicit bias, and it's like sort of through the implicit bias that systemic racism, where people are given advantages based on race, that kind of comes through. And so the idea is the question is how do you disrupt that and equalize things especially for children in this context. So just to put a little bit more context around this. So we were talking about systemic racism, and a few pieces of data that for me are insightful into helping me understand that this kind of systemic racism is happening is like looking, for example, at home ownership rates. Clearly, there's advantages for some groups over others in being able to purchase a home. There's barriers that exist for some groups differently than others. So 77% of white households own a home compared to 57% of Asian, 46% Native American, 45% Latinx, and 24% Black. So you can see that there's a big disparity there. There's advantages of some groups over others. Minnesota ranks lowest in the country in high school graduation rates for African American and Indigenous students. So that gets to, like, when you hear people say worst in the nation, Minnesota's ranking very low in these things. That's one statistic. Also, nationally, we know it's true, but then we know this is happening in Minnesota too. Suspension and expulsions are regularly occurring in preschool settings, but the young boys of color, it happens for them at higher rates than other children. So all of these are these are indicators of what's happening. And we know that these are kind of showing us that this systemic racism exists. So now this is kind of an interesting slide looking at, this was from the Federal Reserve Bank, published this data. They got it from the Department of Education. And it shows like the distribution of scores. And you can see, and it's broken up by different racial groups. So Black or African American students, Latinx, Indigenous or Native American students, white students, and the bottom, the kind of coral colored one is white students, which is kind of blocked. It's hard to tell that. Oh, I see it. There's where it says white. And so what's an interesting thing, and it's hard to see maybe on the screen, but there's like this dotted line that shows the median. And these are for 4th grade reading scores is on the left and 8th grade math scores are on the right. But the kind of the main point is that you can tell by the chart, each bar is like the number of children, like 10%, some children, there's like, for example, if you look at the Asian one, there's 10% of Asian students scoring, that's kind of the scoring low. And as you go up, those are the bars, that's the sort of the numbers of children that are scoring higher on these different tests. And you can see that there's a distribution. So it's not like they're all scoring the same thing, but the median score for that group is further to the left, or scoring lower basically for all of the different groups. And the median score for the white students is higher in both of these two tests. And so again, here's where you're seeing that there's an indication that there's barriers for some reason. There's something about the way our systems are set up that are creating barriers for some groups of students to score as high as the white students, which points again as evidence for the systemic racism that we see. And for us, we know that this is a thing that we need to attend to in our state, and that it starts so early, that kids get behind. It starts so early in the preschool years. So we know that something needs to change, and we collectively need to change. And some of the things that come to mind are, we need to change how children of color are viewed by adults. We need to develop children's abilities. So this is all children's abilities to recognize, respect, hold up, and be sensitive to difference. Because some of this dynamic we know that this dynamic is happening. There's opportunities for us to teach young children how to address this early, how to fix their own implicit bias that they might be getting from, different sources of influence in their worlds, and really help them learn those abilities that they need to not have that implicit bias themselves, and to undo systemic racism as well as they grow up and grow into different roles in life. We also need to teach people about difference, so differences in race, ethnicity, linguistic, gendered, sexual orientation, geographic, and ability. There's so many areas of difference. It's not just racial equity. It's all of those different types of equity are all things that we need to respect, hold up, and be sensitive to. So now I'm going to tell the second part of Minnesota's story that's specific to my agency. And I'll use this as kind of a little bit of an example of equity analysis as we start to get into that part of the discussion. So like I said earlier, that the event of what happened with George Floyd really sparked a lot of change, and it sparked change within my own agency that I work in. So one of the things that happened really early on is that a new leader was hired at our agency to address equity and inclusion. And while we always had staff that did that work, this person was given a higher position within the agency, and she quickly started to hire people. And now throughout the entire Department of Human Services, there's staff whose job it is to attend to doing equity analysis and rooting out systemic racism all throughout the department. So that, and there's tools for equity analysis that are being used by every group within the agency. And then staff throughout the agency receive training on doing equity analysis. And we were also given the opportunity to use something called an intercultural development inventory, which is like a kind of a little self-assessment that you do on your own, and that your scores aren't shared with other people. But they are shared collectively, so that you could see like how many people in your group or within your agency are scoring on different levels of this continuum. And the continuum goes from like denial that there's really racial differences and things like that, to like minimization, like, oh, it's not that big a deal, or just kind of ignore it or something, to really accepting difference and making that part of who you are, to even being able to adapt to cultural and ethnic and linguistic differences and being more adaptive. And so that inventory is something that staff were invited to do throughout the agency and address, and were given coaching to help them. And then we did something called a Parent-Aware Racial Equity Plan and a legislative report, where we did engagement with early educators throughout the state of Minnesota, gathering information about what, to really trying to identify barriers to participating in Parent-Aware. So that was something that within my own group, within our own staff, we did that, and that was, I'll share in a moment sort of a little more details about that to give you an idea, to kind of play out how we used equity analysis in that project. And so now one of the results is that we're implementing a new advisory group structure for Parent-Aware that will make sure that then there's ongoing feedback of folks around Parent-Aware policies ongoing to address racial equity. So now I'll talk a little bit about what is racial, what is using an equity lens, and what is equity analysis. So there's two groups that provided that later, if you want to go look up more information about doing equity analysis, there's this equity action framework that was provided by the BUILD initiative, and there's a link to that. Actually, there's a link to both of this information in the slides. There's links at the bottom, but also in that handout that I provided too. And then the Government Alliance on Race and Equity also has its own equity analysis. That's a really helpful tool. So those would be places you could look for more information about it. But basically, what is equity analysis? In both of those two frameworks that I just shared, the basic idea is first you have to identify the policy problem. But as you're identifying the policy problem, you have to keep in mind things like implicit bias and structural racism, so that you can kind of see and look for disparities, which means a disparity means like one group is getting treated differently than others. So those test score data that I showed you is a great example of a disparity, where you can see that white students were scoring higher on these tests than the other different racial groups. And while there were still people in every racial category scoring in the higher end, it was just as a whole that there were more scoring at higher or lower. And so what you're doing is you're looking for problems like that, where you can see that those kinds of barriers and things exist. And then you have to think about who's impacted. And when you can, you would go right to those groups and ask them, like, how are you impacted? How does this impact you? How are you experiencing this? And then once you have that information, and sometimes you can't go directly to the stakeholders. Sometimes you have to go to people who work with the stakeholders and understand their lived experiences. And so some combination of that, to the extent you can, is the best way to gather that information you need. And then once you have that information, you look at a policy, a process, or a service, and you try to decide what are ways that you can fix that or change the policy so that those negative impacts aren't happening and those barriers are removed, or hopefully you can change it so that the scores aren't higher, or whatever the data is that you're looking at isn't higher for one group, or better or more advantage for one group than for another group. So in the handout that I gave you, and at the end here, hopefully we'll have some time after I'm done presenting. Actually, I think we are going to have some time. We'll look at what I'm going to ask you to do is pull out your handout. And what the handout looks like is it says, closing gaps for young children using an equity lens. That's what it says at the top. And I just pulled out a few experiences from that handout here. But what you'll see is on the left is ideas that someone in a role like mine that works in a government agency might look for. But then there's sort of the parallel ideas, things that someone could do in an early care and education program in the right-hand column. So for most of the people on this call, those examples in the right-hand column would be great examples for you to look at, but I'll just highlight a few. So one thing that an early care and education program could do to address racial equity is look for and could do it using data in an equity lens fashion, as we talked about. Is you could look at data from your child assessment scores, and you could look to see how people are doing, and you could break it out by different categories. It could, whatever the differences are in your group. So if you have racial groups, but maybe it's more ethnicity or linguistic, or maybe even geographical, whatever that is, you could kind of look to see, are there differences in how folks are scoring? And then you could look for ways to individualize your instruction or change things or adapt things to make sure that that the programming that people are getting is consistently available. So then like discipline and addressing issues around expulsion, for example, you could have policies on discipline, and this would be interesting. This is where I'm excited and interested in opening this up to hear from you, so everybody can talk a little bit more and talk about your own ways of addressing this. But the idea is like looking at ways of discipline that don't involve exclusion, don't involve removing a child from a classroom, but rather address it within the classroom and ways to do that. So having policies around that is a concrete thing that a program could do. Addressing experiences, an example around that would be language translation or having access to interpreters so that people could get help if they speak other languages and allow them to access your programs effectively. Or there's also like professional development for staff or training on using culturally responsive practices. So how, what kinds of training could staff get or receive that could help them be more responsive to children's different cultural or linguistic needs. And then the environment. So making materials and classrooms more reflective of lived experiences would be another example of something a program could do. So lots and lots of ideas in there, and I'm looking forward to talking more about that as a group. Here's another example that I really, really love. And when I prepared this presentation, I was just so excited and moved about the idea of like, how do early childhood leaders, like what an amazing opportunity they have to not only make their programs really inclusive and reflective of all different groups, but also what an exciting opportunity to be able to help teach children about difference and really understand and accept differences. And I loved this example that I found. There's a program called Little Naturalists in St. Paul. And she has these words on her website that I found, and I asked her if I could show this example because I think it's a beautiful thing, and I would just love to see it if like every program in the state of Minnesota had a statement like this on their website. And her website says, Little Naturalists is an all-inclusive environment and accepts all religions, backgrounds, and identities. At no point will discrimination of any kind be tolerated. So yeah, that's just such a great example. So now it's time for discussion again. I'll say what the questions are, but then I'll stop sharing so that people can talk to each other. So the questions are, have you addressed equity and barriers to participation in your programs? And then what ideas from the handout resonate with you? So I'll stop sharing. And now we can have a little discussion.
Michelle, would you mind repeating the question just one more time, just for me?
Yeah. Maybe I could put the questions into the chat too. So it says, have you addressed equity, barriers to participation in your programs? There's one question. And then the other question is about ideas that the handout includes that resonate. So, so first, maybe it's just, are people, what ideas would you share about ways that you've addressed equity, or have you ever done anything like an equity analysis in your programs where you would look at experiences of different groups, compare those, and then trying to figure out how do you remove any barriers or things that maybe would prevent people from having, better across the board experiences that would be helpful to share. And then we could just look at the handout together. And I think it's okay if we take time, you know what I mean? Like we can stop and each of us read it individually, and then people can shout out ideas or things that are resonating with them from the handout. I know it's kind of hard to have these kinds of discussions in this online format where you're like, well, I really was just listening. I was just joining to listen. I didn't know I had to participate. But it's much richer experience when people get to talk about these things than just, listen.
I'll share that I'm, because I work at Child Care Aware of Minnesota in the grants department, I am really paying attention to the professional development boxes and just kind of thinking about, changes we've made to our programs so far, and maybe how we can continue to make sure that there is good access for our grants so that people can use them for ongoing education. And as an example, recently we added CDA award applications to our website in Spanish. So it's not really at the classroom level, but I'm looking at this and knowing that the work we do helps programs implement some of these things that you have on the chart. So if people have ideas, be sure to let us know.
Yeah.
I'll share one that really resonated with me on this is taking advantage of early childhood mental health consultation. We really, really loved that program. And unfortunately, because we're now in I think we had it for 2020-21 school year and got so much support from that. And we've had a little bit of support still continuing like a parent ed here or there, but I really do think that program helped support so many children and families when it was available to us. So I don't know, I keep advocating to bring that back if at all possible for at that kind of same intensive level that we had it in that first year. And then also the choosing a pedagogy that's child-led, play-based, and culturally responsive and sustaining. And I can't say enough how important that is and how sad I am that it stops so quickly in so many kindergartens and first grades, and how hard it is. We've had so many parents like, should I wait on kindergarten? Like they're afraid to go to kindergarten because they're just worried that kindergarten isn't going to be ready to meet the needs of what is developmentally appropriate for 5-year-olds and 5-year-olds whose birthday is in August. And they'll be, just barely 5 on day 1 of kindergarten. So I just feel like that looking at how we do kindergarten and first grade and second grade in our state could be something else to think about for the future for that.
Yeah, speaking of both of those things are such great examples. The first one you mentioned, mental health consultation, that I feel like it's not as well named as it should be. It really isn't very descriptive of what they really do, because it makes it feel, I think if you just heard the title, you'd think, oh, maybe people are going to come in and like ask me to sit on a couch and I don't know, like ask me questions about my mother or something. Like you're like, what is this? Is this a therapist session or something? But it's really not. It's what it is like these folks come in and they ask these reflective questions. I mean, actually, so many people here is probably, I mean, really what the parent aware coaches are doing is also a form of reflective consultation. I mean, they're asking you, to tell them about different things. And then as they, and so, but they do that. So these mental health consultants, they come and they really help talk about like different sort of policies and approaches, and but help you think more broadly about the classroom and how you're delivering, whether or not it's culturally responsive. Actually, Amy, if you had even more, I don't have very many specific examples to provide. You can provide some more specifics, but I think it's so great because the thing that's so interesting about it is I've seen the data that comes out of that program, and it reduces expulsions and suspensions. I mean, whatever it is that they're doing, it's like a magical support for programs that results in like much more supportive environments for kids that then results in fewer suspensions and expulsions. It's a really cool thing. It's hard to describe though.
Yeah, sort of like in the intensive year that we had it, like there you get, I think it's like up to 100 hours of service from your mental health consultant, and that can look like a lot of different things. And so we had staff training. She had 5 different trainings she could do for staff that was kind of more, intentional professional development focused training. And then she had parent education topics that she could lead. So we kind of had her do some virtual parent education topics as well. And then she can come in and observe in a classroom. And she can talk with teachers, and then you get consent forms from families, and then she can even observe a child more intentionally and support their family. And she would help connect them too with like childhood mental health services if that was a need for a specific child or the child and their family together. And so it was just very supportive, kind of in all the different ways you might need it, very general and broad, because we all benefit from good mental health education, and then going really specific if there was, even a staff, a child or a parent who needed more intensive supports, that there was resources available. And even just telling the teachers like, yes, what you're doing is right, is, good, and is supporting that child. And, kind of even some like coaching one-on-one with them of like how they could, approach a certain child in a situation where, there's something going on too. So just couldn't say enough about it. And just because she had so much interaction with the staff, it was just such a good relationship, and they, trusted her. And I think that made an impact too, of kind of having that same person who was part of your program, but not, your supervisor or, someone who's just coming in once. I think that helped a lot too. So.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks. I'm going to name a couple others that I see on the list that I'd love to hear examples from people. If you have either done or addressed any of these things in your programs, it'd be great to hear specific examples. So here's one, a couple under processes and experiences. So it's sort of partway down the page, on the first page on the right-hand side. And it says integrating different cultures and languages into your program. And then, providing materials like things in children's home languages, using interpreters, things that help people fully participate. This other one though too is also interesting. I'd be curious if any of you do this, if you have different funding streams, and if you ever have to like wrestle with how do you serve all of the children in such a way that the funding stream is available classroom wide so that kids aren't isolated. So like all the kids with early learning scholarships are in one classroom, and all the kids in Head Start are in another classroom if you have a Head Start partnership. Or that's just another thought that would be interested to hear how programs might be doing that. But let's just start with the first one maybe. Can anyone name an example of needing to think about integrating different cultures or languages into a program, so all kids feel welcome and things like that?
I'll go ahead and talk, so I'm not called on.
Yeah.
I did this, I used to work at a center as the infant teacher, and I did this. I had a boy from Bosnia, and he didn't really speak English at all. His mom spoke English, but she lived with her parents and they spoke Bosnian, and I didn't know anything about Bosnian at all. So I just worked with his grandma, and we got some words, keywords and phrases, and like 1 through 10, and just a bunch of little things for the 1-year-olds. And I put that up around my classroom. And I'm from San Diego, California, and Lunar New Year is the big thing that we celebrate in Southern California. And so I brought that to my classroom too. Just, I didn't even think about it. It was just something that you celebrate, even if you're not of Asian descent. It's just a big celebration. And so I brought that into my classroom as well. And I got a lot of notes from parents who I didn't even know had Asian family members who were saying that they were excited to see that and they had never experienced someone in Minnesota celebrating Lunar New Year or just being very comfortable with it. And so for me, like, since I have a little bit of a different background, that just felt very natural to me. But also my director was very encouraging and I just said, hey, I have this idea, and she just let me run with it. So I felt confident to do that. And I know that's not everybody's experience, but that was how I kind of tried to incorporate it and just kind of make it a fun celebration, and we're all learning together. Another thing that I did, even outside of culture and language, I had a little girl with Down syndrome. Only for a few months, her nanny was giving birth. And so they brought her to our program just as the meantime. But I never separated her, you know, even if I sat behind her to make sure she was secure and safe, she was participating with all the other children. And even at home, they said she was crawling better. She was participating with objects and things better than she was before. And I think it's because of that kind of attitude. And her parent and nanny said, like, include her, don't try to separate her. If you're worried about her, like, make sure she's with the kids. And so I really tried to do that with her. And I mean, she just flourished. I was sad to see her leave because she did really well and she got a lot more motor skills and a lot more confidence moving around independently. And so yeah, it's kind of just taking the risk and doing it, and you see such great benefits from it. And so yeah, that's what I've experienced.
Wow, those are great examples. I love that. Oh, those are fantastic. I'm wondering, I could name more things from the sheet. Does anybody else see things though that are especially want to give people a chance to talk, or bring up things that they're especially interested in or can give good examples of? Anything coming to mind for anyone? No? I'll
I
name
can
them.
go ahead.
Oh, good, go.
I
Thank
no
you.
longer work in a program, but I have a really good example from a couple of years ago when I was working in a program. We had children in our preschool. It's a very small preschool, just one classroom, but we had children that spoke Russian, 2 of them, and we had a child that spoke Vietnamese and another child that spoke Spanish. And so this is pretty common, you know, posting words in different languages, but we would use those words. I would ask the parents to give me a list, like I would give them a list of the words that I wanted in their language, and then we would post all those words together, and then we would do 1 or 2 words at a time because that was way too many words to try to work on with preschoolers all at once. So we would use those words in our daily activities and routines, not like have special activities with them, but we just integrated them into the routines and the activities that we were already doing. So I don't remember any of the words now because it's been a while, but words like food and eat and bathroom and fork and spoon were not common words for some people. So we eliminated some of those because of that. Let's see, those were a lot of the words around bathrooming and eating, playing, words around playing like friends, things like that. Those types of words also we used because those were really necessary for the kids to really communicate. And they all spoke English, but some of them not very well. So it was a good experience for them to learn our words, but it was a very good experience for all of the English speaking children to learn their words so that they could communicate with their non-English speaking peers better.
That's
So,
great. Wow, what a fun example.
yeah, we didn't learn very many words, but we learned keywords in many languages.
That's great. I saw Karen Sullivan coming on. I thought maybe, Karen, did you have something you wanted to share? No. Oh, you're on mute.
No, I didn't. I just realized my video was off, so here I am.
Okay. Okay, that's
I've been
fine.
listening though.
Yeah, I was just looking for indications that maybe people had things they wanted to share. I'll name another interesting one. I was just trying to think of one where there's a disparity that we see on the public policy side, but then there's that's kind of what I tried to do with the handout, is on the left, I put things that are just things that are like barriers or that we're trying to address on the public policy side. And then what would be sort of its parallel thing on the how you would implement or address it in the program side. One thing we know statewide is that for whatever reasons, and we're trying to get to the bottom of those reasons so that we can correct the disparity, but we know that there's barriers to people of color in order to get a degree or credential of some kind. So like a CDA or a AA or a bachelor's degree or something like that. And so one of the questions is, so the policy side is like, well, how do we do outreach or make sure that there's scholarships available to make sure that people for whatever someone's race or ethnicity, but if they're experiencing some sort of barrier that they can access it, and then maybe by removing any barriers, that would increase or address that this disparity of access to degrees and credentials. And so like on the program side, maybe that's the way that would play out. Perhaps I don't know. And that's why I'm asking, that's why I'm asking you guys to hear. I'd love to hear specific examples. Are there ways to help maybe assistant teachers or folks that are like at earlier or that you can sort of grow your own, where you bring in someone who doesn't have a degree or credential, but you instantly kind of helping them move along a career path? Is that something that you see in programs? Is that an example of a disparity that folks can work on at a program level, or that anyone has examples of what works, when it works?
I mean, there's a very affordable pathway to getting a CDA license through Penn State. It's like I've had a few assistant teachers go through that program, and they're like $5 classes, and we definitely pay for them, and you buy a book, and then just whenever there's like time where they can work on it during work hours, we try to support that, because I think it's hard if you have a lot of family commitment or that. But I think one of the biggest challenges is like this field still doesn't quite pay enough. And I think like the things that I've been seeing the state do with the like child care stabilization grants and stuff, like making it so it's easier to pay teachers more money without charging families more money, might also like that motivation to like work in this field and stay in this field. I think because you see it as like not just I'll have a livable wage, but boy, I might have like a wage that I feel comfortable like settling down in this like field and in this like community or city or whatever it might be. But I do think that Penn State CDA is a really reasonable pathway for at least staff that they've both been, English is their first language. So I don't know,
Sure.
if that's available in other languages or not. We haven't had to look at that pathway yet. So.
Sure. And actually the child care aware system offers a CDA pathway too, right? Is that available in other languages? Do you guys know, or someone answer?
Yeah, the curriculum is translated into Spanish, Somali, and Hmong, and can be coordinated through any of our district offices as a face-to-face learning community. And then we also offer online CDA training through our online learning platform, Ear to Learn. And those learning communities, they include the instruction of the 120 hours that are required for training for any of those three practice-based CDA types, the infant, toddler, the preschool, and the family child care. And they also include support in the assembly of the professional portfolio as well.
That's great. That's really good. Well, we've only got a few more minutes left. I mean, I can throw out just a few other examples. Yeah, I loved that, Amy, that you called out the one about choosing a pedagogy that's child-led, play-based, and culturally responsive and sustaining. I think that would be one of the funnest things of getting to be the early educator. Some days I wish I could just quit my job and go work in an early childhood program because it's so much fun to get to make those kinds of choices. Yeah, so let's see, I saw one other one that I thought was, I mean, maybe just if anyone wanted to throw out favorite trainings, because one of the things that this moment in time with George Floyd, I think triggered for everyone was like, people were, I don't know about in your programs, but people that I saw, we were like rushing out to find like, oh, I want to go to a training related to cultural responsiveness of some kind, or learning more about this because, or doing the Me and White Supremacy book and those kinds of things. Does anybody have any favorite experiences to share about any training they received that's helped them in this area?
We did a parent ed probably 2 years ago with Dr. Bravada. I don't know if anyone's ever met her. I think she's doing one at the Children's Mental Health conference that's coming up in March or April. But she did a training for our parents and kind of talked about like raising white kids and like other kinds of parts of that, like, and how to raise like anti-racist. It kind of had a lot of really like helpful themes, but she taught it in a way that was very accessible for families and wherever they were in their kind of learning about it. So I really enjoyed her.
Well,
She's a consultant, or like you can have her come as a consultant. I mean, obviously it has a cost associated with it.
What's her name?
Dr. Bravada or Dr. B. I'll pull it up.
Yeah, stick it in the chat. Thank you. Anybody else have any favorite or even things you learned in a training? Or
I would say on the parent aware side, I sometimes, again, the people that I work with are simply kind of happy where they are, and sometimes need to be very gently nudged along. And so I literally go to the QDP and just go, well, you know, the current research says, and blah, blah, blah. And I go to the why, and then I kind of help and I dig a little bit. So if we're changing it and upgrading in like 2 years or so, and adding a cultural piece, or, you know, trauma-informed care and cultural responsiveness piece, we're going to be requiring culturally responsive training, you know. And so sadly, I mean, I remember I was around like 30 years ago when, you know, we had to take cultural training, and oh my gosh, it was a nightmare. People were just mad, and it was just so silly and very white centric. But if it's required, it'll give us another opportunity to help encourage and poke and dig a little bit. And it opens eyes, you know, whether you want your eyes to be opened or not. So sometimes.
And it does feel like people are at a different place now than what you're describing then. I think that people have moved to a new place.
30 years, I remember it, and it was crazy how crazy people were. Now it is different, but again, you know, some people are simply more open and thinking, and some are just like, why do we have to do this stuff? And so I'm just trying to get people.
There's a mix. Yep. Interesting. Well, we've only got 2 minutes left. Does anybody have any last questions before we wrap up? Thank you all for joining this and coming to talk with me today and being a part of this session. This was fun for me to get to do something different over the lunch hour and get out of the office, so to speak, online, out of the office. No questions? Okay. All right. Well, thanks so much. And I appreciate everyone for joining, and I hope this session was helpful.
Thank you, Michelle. I so appreciate you being here today. And thanks to all of our participants for answering questions and being engaged in the dialogue today. It was great to see you all. Have a great rest of your week. Bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.